la vérité touche au réel.
Young Jacquians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Spriglia, Isabel Millar.
Engaging in conscious. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
Hey, what is up, everybody? It is us, the Vanishing Mediators, joined today by Andrew the Big Signorelli Flores. I am Nick Castellucci, and today we are honored in the extreme to welcome a guest to the channel, Dr. Lorenzo Chiesa, author of what I consider to be one of the most seminal surveys of Lacan's entire system, Subjectivity and Otherness, required reading for anyone who's even mildly interested in Lacan, and the Not To. What's the subtitle? Logic and
God of all
God.
things.
Logic and God in Lacan, right? Or
yeah.
We're so thrilled to have you on the channel because both of these texts are works that we have returned to again and again. The Not To it's quite difficult, but I mean that as a compliment. Whereas I would say Subjectivity and Otherness is a bit more accessible. Subjectivity and Otherness has been very helpful for us because we are working through the first three seminars. We completed the first two. We're, I think, almost halfway through three. And, the way you formulate and condense early Lacanian thinking has definitely helped us to orient ourselves in this very, very difficult, dark forest of linguisterie. But we're not here today to talk about early Lacan so much, although I'm sure that thought will figure into it. We'd like to, I guess, mostly explore some of the ideas that you've undertaken to clarify in the Not To, which, as the subtitle mentions, has to do with logic, God, the absence of the sexual relationship, and I would say it's an overall attempt to systematize different strains of thought in Lacan, oriented around this sort of central hub of the concept of the absence of the sexual relationship. What does that really mean? And how can we kind of break through some of the doxa surrounding this statement, which I think too often is reduced to a kind of general principle rather than something that is an active negative strain within Lacan and sort of, runs through the entire oeuvre. But I'd like to just jump right into the questions that we have for you. The first one is quite simple, but maybe almost kind of loaded in its simplicity. The answer will be far from simple, I'm sure, but this is something we've been grappling with for a while. Again, I think the doxa often creates a sort of easy equation between libido and drive, or there's this notion that libido is ultimately superseded by the theory of drive, maybe, and libido falls away or becomes a theory of jouissance later in Lacan. But in the Not To, you make a very careful argument for the interrelation of two ideas which are distinct but very interrelated. So in your mind, what is the difference between libido and drive.
Thanks, Nick. And let me just repeat what I said right before we went on air. That is to say, I appreciate the fact you sent a couple of questions in advance, and they are, as we were saying before, they are short, succinct, very good, but also, as you just said, like overloaded. They are huge questions. They are very good, but huge questions and difficult questions. Hence, I did a bit of homework in preparation for the interview, but not too much homework, so that you can interrupt me and challenge my answers. And starting from my quick answer to your quick but loaded question, then we can establish a dialogue and probably complexify the attempted answers I will give to you. So, what is the difference between drive and libido? I think there is a difference, but at the same time, so we start with an almost an antinomy. They are very contiguous concepts. So there is a difference, but they are closely related concepts, and this is what makes the question difficult. My attempted answer would be to say that drive is a materialist understanding of libido, as otherwise tendentially a vitalist and idealist notion. So even better, drive is pulsion, a Lacanian answer, revision, and even critique of the Freudian notion of libido. So we are dealing with psychoanalytical notions, but they are overloaded, in my view, in Lacan's view, I dare to say, philosophically. So how do we think libido in a non-vitalist and non-idealist way? And I think vitalist and idealist go together here. So again, drive is an attempted understanding of libido by Lacan and the Lacanians from a supposedly, arguably, materialist and realist perspective instead of an idealist and vitalist. The other way to put this would be to say that, and it's a kind of like explanation of the first quick answer, drive could be said to be, I was going to say drivido, which is nice, right? Drivido. Drive is libido minus the assumption that there is out there in life a kind of free-floating but ultimately unifying sexual energy. So we said like drive is, tendentially or at least aspirational, a materialist notion, right? And libido is for Lacan, but I sympathize very much with Lacan here. In Freud, a vitalist and idealist notion. So, okay, but what is libido at the end of the day, right? It is a kind of sexual energy basic sexual energy for Freud. And what is the problem with the way in which Freud understands this sexual energy? Interestingly, via what was then in Freud's time quite widespread scientific assumption. So it's not a kind of wacko kind of vitalism. It's quite scientifically 19th century based vitalism. I think this is the big difference between drive and libido, i.e., for Freud, at the end of the day, libido is, we can put it more pseudoscientifically, a free-floating energy, but unifying, because libido is eros, right? So it's a unifying principle. But philosophically, it's a kind of substance. And what kind of substance is that? It's a kind of like life, isn't it? It's a kind of like thrust of life, which is what sex is about. And this is not good for Lacan. This is like philosophically, theoretically, something that clashes with, I would say, the framework of what he's been thinking, even without periodizing about different stages, right? And I would go as far as saying that, in a way, this is one of the points where Lacan disagrees the most with Freud, not right from the start, but it becomes quite, brutal and cynical in later years about this idea of a unifying principle. You can call it eros, love, or you can call it libido. I think that's a basic distinguo. And then, opening up things. This next point is in a sense coming out directly from the first point. That is to say, if, libido is a unifying sexual, interestingly, free-floating somehow, right? Free-floating, like, experiments of magnetism in the 80s, 70s or something. Free-floating, but philosophically unifying for Freud principle. So it's a principle of oneness somehow, however free-floating, right? What is the main point about the drive for Lacan? That the drive is always partial. So you have the partial drive versus the unifying libido, at least in terms of like a primordial principle of life, because this is what it is for Freud scientifically, but that's old-fashioned science, which was overloaded with a lot of like philosophically vitalistic assumptions. So I think that's the other way of putting it. And then last point, but here things open up quite radically. I think at least for Lacan, the whole point is not, leaving aside these polemics with Freud, it's not so much to pin down the difference between drive and libido, which I try to do myself in the note too. The big point, leaving aside the polemics, i.e. drive is a better version of libido, to cut a long story short, the big point is to understand, and this is where things get very complex, what is the connection and the difference between drive, desire, and love. Triangulating between those three notions, like give you like a big chunk of Lacanian theory. It's a complex triangulation.
I do have something to say and maybe add to that, because I do find it interesting, and you pointed out, because I never saw it like this, that Freud was in his scientific era trying to find a unifying theory. And it's interesting when you look at his theory of, you could say, libido, but as he's working up to it from the Project for Scientific Psychology, he has his theory of excitation that's developed in the sci-fi and omega structure. But then he gets rid of that. And I don't know if it was you that said this in this book, or if I'm just reading, I read it from something else, but he goes from a sort of biological physiognomy investment to a sort of psychology with pleasure and unpleasure, which is libido. But it's like, even in his unifying way of trying to unify something, he finds a division, which ultimately he sticks with a dualism of, you have libido drives and ego drives. And I think that, like, with this, it led to a confusion with not only that, but his death drive, or realization of the death instinct, that you get like these revisionists that see libido, for lack of a better term, in a sort of stage animistic way, like taking too seriously this development of like oral, anal, latency, phallic, etc. And then like the object relationist like Fairburn, that's like, no, libido is object invested. But I think Lacan is doing something different in resuscitating the materialist aspect of it via the drive. Because what I find interesting is, well, and you say this in the second chapter of in seminar 4, his hydroelectric power plant model, that it's like libido is retroactively inscribed with the Holy Spirit of the signifier. And with that, and I think the purloin letter, and then even the optical schema, we kind of get this attempt to say like, no, like this is a materialist definition of libido, especially when you look at the optical schema. It's like we then have a structuralist aspect that shows how autoerotism, narcissism, and object love are possible.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much in there, and I first and foremost, I agree, and I think also something you said right at the beginning is a good way to problematize my answer. That is to say, we should not generalize Freud himself. That is to say, even for Lacan, or the way I read Lacan in materialist manner, assuming that Lacan has a materialist agenda, and I guess like it's really difficult to disagree there. Of course, there is the Freud of the Entwurf, the very early Freud, and that's a much better Freud. That was your first point, and I totally agree in a sense. I mean, the problem is precisely when you get to a certain, not just psychology, but metapsychology. I mean, a metapsychology is basically a worldview. It is basically a philosophy of nature in an old-fashioned metaphysical sense. So the critique of libido via the renewed notion of the drive as an attempt to think libido materialistically should be directed for Lacan, the way I understand Lacan, precisely to the metapsychology. I mean, here the bad book is Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Paradoxically enough, instead, the book, which in a way has kind of intuition of what will be Lacan's theory of the drive, and we need a number of steps to argue that, is the Entwurf. It's interesting, isn't it? The Entwurf, the project, right? The early pre-psychoanalytical, usually considered to be pre-psychoanalytical, and Lacan would say, no. You get there basically in what is an anticipation of actually the scientific notion of the neuron. So you have the pleasure principle, the reality principle, but then it's all embedded in what will be neurons, right? Interestingly enough, I mean, so kind of like good science. This is not the Freud of the metapsychology, which leads me to my second remark. So I think you said like there's a materialist resuscitation there, and I would agree fully. It's a very nice formula. I mean, in a sense, like Lacan is not just saying down with the libido, let's replace it with the drive. He's also saying like, you have to make your own choices when you read Freud. And perhaps like the fear of the drive, that would be an interesting paper for someone to write, is a materialist resuscitation of intuitions that Freud had concerning at least the pleasure principle, the reality principle, and the beyond the pleasure principle that were already embedded in the Entwurf. And the first half of Seminar 7, much abused seminar, right? It's all about Antigone. No. The first half of Seminar 7 that very few people read carefully is all about the Entwurf. So like I'm saying, I mean, this is really great Freud. And you brought in also the death drive, and that also leads me to a correction to my answer. I mean, so libido is a kind of animistic, vitalistic, free-floating, but ultimately unifying substance, right? And this is philosophically problematic from a materialist point of view. Even if we complexify that and we say libido is zero, and then the objection is, oh, but later on, there's a dualism, right, in Freud. Well, it's even earlier on. There's the death drive and eros, right? The problem still remains the same according to Lacan. The introduction of a dualism there. So you have the pro-life. Just allow me the joke, the pro-life and the pro-choice principles, right? Eros and the death drive, the death instinct, actually. Still, we don't solve that problem in Freud, according to Lacan, by saying, well, basically, the death instinct is the opposite of eros qua libido qua unifying principle. You're still into deep shit, materialistically speaking, there, right? And then the following question, which is huge and difficult, is like, okay, but then what is the death instinct / death driving Lacan? Which is a very difficult question.
We I know we want to get to the second question, but there are so many compartments to what we're talking about right now, and I'd like to highlight something that Andrew pointed out, and that you linger over this metaphor, this extended metaphor of the electric power plant is it Seminar 4?
Yeah,
that he talked about that. Yeah, and
which is like a borrowing from Heidegger, by the way.
Okay. See, I wasn't aware of that. And I know he was in his kind of quasi Heideggerian phase or moving out of it at that point. But what's interesting is that like we have an energetics, maybe rather than an energy. And something that you say is that, and I've struggled with this very sentence, I'm paraphrasing, but that we have a potential energy and a kinetic energy. But unlike how we conceptualize these in science, we have a kinetic energy which is somehow like subdued and annulled by a potential energy. And we can understand this through the metaphor of the hydroelectric plant. And that the way I've tried to understand it, if my breakdown makes any sense, it's sort of like we have all of these partial forces, for lack of a better term, not working together necessarily. All of these different processes, which could be described maybe as cyclical, but once they are theorized or thematized together, inevitably something like an energy, a unifying principle has to be postulated. That would be libido, but then the partiality of drive or the part drives as they exist independently of one another constitute a different question. But the two questions are only coincidentally almost related, but there's no way to really, if let's say libido is the source of drive and there's this notion that drive returns to its source, that too easily lends itself to the kind of vitalism that you're talking about. And I think maybe I don't want to put words into your mouth, but maybe you would even take issue with the way Slavoj Žižek sometimes characterizes drive in this sense. This is, I know it's kind of a rambling question, and not even a question so much as, is there anything there that you'd like to use as a springboard for further elaborations?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I go back to something you said at the beginning of your intervention, and I think I totally agree with. I mean, summarizing what we've said, a materialist view on these issues says that energetics comes prior to energy. Basically, this is the point, right? I mean, you need to actually build the dam and make some calculations, after which you can also speak of the energy of the river, right? So, retrospectively, the river is libido, right? If I start by saying, well, there's energy, libido in the river, Lacan says this is pure animism. He says, like, it's like speaking about the sprite of the current, right? So that is a bit of a brutal, if you were to criticize Freud for that sounds pretty brutal, but I think there is that aspect in Freud. Which is not to say that, energy per se is a taboo notion, I mean, energy follows from energetics, which is the same as saying what Lacan says. I think you just read like the first 3 seminars. It's in seminar 2, I think, where he says, like, I'm not saying life is something transcendent we don't know anything about. I'm just saying we don't know anything but metabolism, what comes in and what comes out. You can count, right? It's the same argument, right? So I didn't want to sound too, like libido is a taboo word. It depends on, we can still speak of energy. And that's why I made that perhaps a bit pedantic and perhaps not so well scientifically founded distinction in the knot too between potential energy and kinetic energy, right? I myself use the notion of potential energy or constant force to say this is the kind of energy and force we can legitimately speak about from a materialistic point of view. Whereas if we start thinking of, like the drive as a kind of thrust carried out by the sprite of the current, then we are in tricky for a materialist, a realist philosophical territory, right? So in a way, I guess, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also saying, there's a materialistic, I thought you were saying also, there is a materialistic way we can speak about energy, right?
I'm thinking of what you were saying earlier about energy is this in the Freudian sense, in the psychological sense of it being something unifying and unitary, and yet free floating. It's like with Lacan, we have a kind of theory that is often characterized as structuralist, post-structuralist, one that would do away with the subject. But psychoanalysis, in some sense, invokes a different kind of matter or material. And I think that, and here I feel a little bit over my head because I don't even really understand everything that I'm saying, but maybe that's good, going out on a limb here. But it's sort of like with psychoanalysis, what we get is a linguistic materiality, and that my intuition is that somehow this question of drive versus libido, how they're interrelated, or distinct, whether libido can be superseded, also answers this question of, like what you were saying before about desire, drive, love. I think that many of the common assumptions about these ideas, even among some of the best Lacanians, don't factor in the kind of materialism that I guess you and Johnston especially have been.
Yeah. No. I think you.
I don't know if any of that made any sense, but
no, absolutely. But you know what? I mean, to actually say Freud's fake materialism is actually a form of idealistic vitalism, because this is the whole point, right? Like, by endorsing the sciences of his century, Freud ends up with a notion of libido as free-floating but ultimately unifying energy that is vitalistic and animistic, the sprite of the current, right? This is not to say that the river or libido does not matter, because that is a mistake that a lot of Lacanians make. That is to say, nature or the corporeal still matter, because you see, like, in what I said so far, there is a risk of saying, well, like, we just care about the plant, we don't care about the river. And that's a common mistake, because that's a kind of like vulgar structuralist approach, or linguistic theory you mentioned, right? Of course, we should also account for the fucking river, right? Because analogically, so river equals libido in our discussion, at least. And what does it lead us to more philosophically? That's the body, that's nature, right? Of course, we should not forget about the river. The point is, like, how to think that interaction between the contingent plant, because this is the other limit of the analogy. There's not an engineer of the plant. The plant is a bit like the Holy Spirit, in the sense that just one day it just popped up, because otherwise you have like the question of who built the dam, which is where the analogy is limited. But yes, in a sense, I think maybe it goes back to what you were saying earlier. I mean, we should not bar the use of terms such as energy. And why? Well, because more generally, we should not bar from this discussion, which is, in a way, starting off from the presupposition that we want a materialist and realist psychoanalysis, we should not rule out the importance of the river or libido. It's just a matter of, like, again, putting energetics prior to energy. And this is also, like, quite closely linked to your final comment question. Yes, I think, like, on these issues, not everything we've said so far, but from now on, or at least the last few minutes, there's a disagreement between me and Slavoj, because I don't think he's a Freudian in the bad sense. I don't think so. I don't think he endorses a kind of like, as I said, vitalistic and idealistic notion of libido as per this simplified version of what Freud is saying. I do think, however, that, you know, he basically identifies drive, allow me the simplification, with a kind of like radical negativity that is out there, full stop. You know, like that's what leads him to speak about curvatures, the swerving of the real, or, you know, winking at, you know, German idealism, the night of the word. Yes, I think like I guess like Slavoj would start off with something very similar to what I said in terms of like, you know, juxtaposing, even opposing Lacan and Badiou. Lacan and Badiou, it's another slip of the tongue. Lacan and Freud on the question of like drive versus better than libido. But then when it comes to thinking libido, I think Slavoj would come up with, I would say, a certain metapsychological notion of the drive, which I'm not entirely at ease with, in the name of materialism. So his agenda is the same, of course.
Well, maybe we can use this to transition to, I'm going to, if it's okay with you, skip one of the questions, because this question of there being a kind of radical negativity outside of symbolic differentiality, I think we can segue into, if you're cool with it, your concept of indifference, which I guess you kind of set up somewhat, maybe not, maybe in opposition is too strong, but at least to contrast with what maybe is unbeknownst to the Slavoj, or I'm sure, I think he did respond to you in Incontinence of the Void, if I'm not mistaken, but a reintroduction of a kind of, I guess we could call it animism, in this sense that there is a radical negativity that he often metaphorizes with this idea of like a curvature that is a negativity that's even more primordial than the negativity that's simply introduced through the differentiality of language. It seems to me that your concept of indifference sort of tries to bridge this gap in a way.
Absolutely. Yes, the two questions are very much related, because in a way I would say what I cannot agree with in terms of the drive, with respect to what Slavoj says, is that in a sense drive is a differential something out there independently of signifying differentiality. So the two questions, you know, like they're very much related. Yes, and in difference, and then in my more recent work, especially the book with Adrian, I've tried to actually then, you know, further elaborate on the notion whereby in difference you can italicize both the in and the difference. Maybe we'll get there. But yes, it's my way in, or my portmanteau term, to actually deal with this big ontological questions. And your question was, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, not only what is indifference, but how do you actually triangulate that with indifference written all together and difference, right? And it's another tough question, but thanks for the question, because it's really, you know, like my Lacan beyond Lacan, where I'm trying to find my own original voice in a way. Quick answer: in difference. So, you know, like the one with the iPhone. To cut a long story short, for me, is pure difference. You know, in 20th century, especially French thought, you know, all the big names have a different notion of what pure difference is, right? My take on pure difference is what I call indifference. What do I mean by that? One way of articulating it would be to say that indifference, and I'm still not italicizing one or the other parts of the word, indifference is the elusive point of the immanent emergence of, call it however you like, structure, the symbolic language, we can be very general here, from the real. Here, a real also for nature. So indifference is the point of immanent emergence, let's say, of language out of nature. This is like too brutal in a way. Another way to put it would be to say that that point of emergence of structure from the real, we can also name it the void. I think we can also name it the void. It's not the same thing, but I think we are not mistaken if we say that that notion of the void or the empty set is very close to the notion of the latter in Lacan. So there's a number of crucial, both intra-Lacanian and philosophically more generally interesting notions that pop up there. It's a condensation, a point of connection between a number of different crucial set of questions. Now, if we take indifference, and I'm still not, italicizing one or the other part of the word as our privileged standpoint, then we can also, from my standpoint, understand difference and indifference. So difference would be quite straightforwardly signifying differentiality, mediated from structural linguistics, but with a twist. So signifying differentiality is what? It is the fact that the phoneme b is given only as non-v, right? You don't have b and v and t. You have b as only differentially related to v as non-p, and v as non-p is differentially related, blah, 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 right? So that's signifying differentiality with the important distinguo, i.e. difference at the end of the day, right? With the important distinguo that obviously in Lacan, unlike for structural linguistics, that's a simplification, but let's put it like that, this signifying differentiality is not self-contained, right? Because we are operating on a level of incompleteness. So, and this signifying differentiality, which is what I would call difference, is not yet difference in a vulgar sense. That is to say, qualitative difference, which entails sameness, right? If I say, let's think of phonemes, right? B, this is already Saussure in a way. B is non-V. You don't have B different from V. B is non-V, V is non-B, and so on and so forth. Of course, then there is a kind of class of that, if you want to put it like that, and that would be problematic for Lacan, right? So it's only on the basis of signifying difference that then we can construct ontogenetically, but also ontologically, a vulgar notion of difference. That is to say, this hand is different from this hand. So indifference, let me just sum up. So indifference is pure difference. We can think of the void and the letter as very, very close notions there. Difference is signifying difference as per structural linguistics applied to the unconscious, of course, with a twist. And then indifference, in a sense, is retrospectively, with regard to everything we've said, perhaps I'll dare to propose, indifference is that which is not signifying differentiality. Indifference is that which is not, even better, it is that which was, is, and will not be signifying differentiality. And this is the difficult bit. And my, dialogue with Adrian this is where we have a disagreement, including signifying differentiality itself, right? Because that's the interesting bit. Otherwise, there's nothing really new under the sun in what I've been saying, right? So the privileged standpoint, and this could be clinical in Lacan, first and foremost, it is ontogenetic, if not phylogenetic. So ontophylogenetic, but also ontological in a purely philosophical sense. And this is like the big dialogue with Badiou here, of course. I mean, I think in this, if you frame things in the way I've been saying now, Lacan is more Badiousian than Zizek. Let me propose that. So indifference, qua pure difference, from which standpoint I can think difference as signifying differentiality and retrospectively indifference, on condition that indifference includes signifying differentiality. And a lot of, like, in the book, when it comes out, hopefully soon, you'll see that's my basic disagreement with Adrian, where Adrian does not agree with me, because this is very different from his own kind of transcendental materialism as applied to a philosophy of nature, I think. I can go more into that, but perhaps there's already quite a lot.
So my comment, and it'll lead up to my question, is kind of going back to what we originally talked about in regards to the hydroelectric power plant, because as you pointed out, it's like you need the dam to be made before you could have the water, and as we talk about libido, but like this emphasis of Lacan's Holy Spirit of the signifier, I think is really important, because I mean, he attributes repetition compulsion to it. That he contributes the death drive to that in Seminar 4, and I find it quite interesting, because what is the signifier doing but inscribing it? And like, if we take it psychoanalytically, well, you can't have, the signifiers come out without speech, the speech act, the psychoanalytic act. So it's like that is the transference, and the speech is like the sort of dam built for the libido and the energetics to come about, and that signifier is the measurement. But the signifier logic is the signifier represents the subject for another signifier, and with repetition compulsion, it's like you have this and I'm going off of like our stuff from Seminar 2, the impossibility of accounting for oneself as the subject in this computation of the signifiers, because he talks about odds and evens with the embedded impossibility of a 3 coming after a 1. The letter is always delayed, stolen, but somehow still makes it. And even logical time with this retroactive impossibility of certainty and hesitation. So like these different logics of impossibility and accounting for oneself. And I find that interesting, because it's like this is like the movement of the signifier, the movement of libido or drive somehow ends up in a antagonism of impossibility with itself. And I mean, that leads me to like, well, how does this relate to the signifier and the phallus? And if that's the case, if they have a relation, what then makes the phallus and its function a transcendental logic for sexuation? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it does. But yeah, this is like, maybe we should, continue the conversation.
Because that's my question.
Because I think like the phallus, I'm not sure how much it helps at this stage, to be honest. I mean, let me just give it a go, but there won't be an answer on the phallus. And trying to put together what we were discussing earlier, like in terms of the hydroelectric plant and the discussion we had about drive and libido, and then the second question, because maybe like, there's a strong link even there somehow. So, and you mentioned like the Holy Spirit of the signifier, blah, 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 etc., right? I guess the question, and always thinking in terms of the analogy of the river and the hydroelectric plant, is to try and distinguish which I think is something that Lacan is struggling with, but successfully so. The idea of, the hydroelectric, well, one thing is like, first you have the river. We should not say that there's an energy in the river, blah, blah, blah. And then you have scenario 2, you have like the working hydroelectric plant, right? I think the missing point there, and I guess like this is very close to the point of indifference, right, is a first kind of damming of the river, which is not the electric plant. Let's say whatever kind of animal, let's say a beaver, why not, right? Damming up tentatively that river. And in a kind of, as you were also mentioning, Andrew, I mean, of course, there's always like a retrospective temporality at stake there, right? But I guess that the relationship between the pure river and the hyper-efficient, which is never hyper-efficient, of course, the unconscious is not, hydroelectric plant, it's always a bit fucked up, right? There are power shortages, blah, 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 right? It's not an optimal plant, right? But I guess like, to think that relationship, which is in very stupid, simplified terms, the relationship between nature and culture at the end of the day, we need to also, via this retroactive temporality, but also logically adopt first and foremost the perspective of the first tree that fell accidentally or because of some animal activity and blocked the waters. This is not giving you an answer on the phallus, but it is in a way putting together question 1 and question 3. There's much more to say. I mean, please, if you want to get back with more on the phallus, so if we go on with this analogy taken into different contexts, what would be the question about the phallus?
Yeah, it's just like taking this logic of the signifier, and again, like I'm mixing both like the statement or this axiom of the signifier is the subject for another signifier with what Lacan builds up again in Seminar 2 with the purloined letter and the odds and evens of like the signifier is computating, accounting for itself, this sort of recreational mathematics that only has a truth effect when it's combinatory, and yet there's an embedded impossibility. And so my question is like, if we take that as the case with the signifier, how does that relate to the phallic function? And
but again, I think like and that relates a lot to one or two of the other questions, maybe the second one. I guess like, for instance, like, and you read Seminar 2 recently, when Lacan speaks about, his fascination for early cybernetics, for instance, right? And also like in terms of temporality earlier on, the sophism of the prisoners. I think in a way, what is deceptive there is that he's not talking about, signifying differentiality. He's talking about the letter, to be honest. He's talking about the letter. I mean, we have, and this goes back to signifying differentiality being included in indifference. As we can speak of the first tree that contingently or not, I mean, due to an animal or to a storm, fell and blocked the course of the river, right? That does not stop there. This is the point he's making when he's talking about cybernetics. I mean, our binary use of numbers in ultra advanced machines does not have to do, allow me the analogy again, with the functioning but not so functioning hydroelectric plant. It has to do with an incredibly sophisticated logic of felling trees and nothing more. I mean, we are really playing with analogies here, but so you get my point. So where is like the phallic signifier or a phallic logic entering the scene? I guess the phallic, and always, we are always thinking about a retroactive temporality. The phallic logic, I guess, enters the scene when the guy who is deputed to actually start the machines of the hydroelectric plant for the first time, he pushes the button and it doesn't fucking work. And it needs some sort of, you know, support of any kind. You know, like the walls of the dam need some extra pillars. And we'll stop with the analogies, right? But because, of course, like the plant is not only never working optimally, but the first time you push the button, it doesn't work at all. Actually, there's a kind of Chernobyl situation whereby they know that the river will destroy the plant in the next 5 minutes. Hence, they have to come up with something temporal that then becomes temporal qua transitional, that then becomes the kind of like non-optimal structure of the river. And that will be the phallic function. I didn't answer specifically on the phallos, because then the phallos would be, the master signifier, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And maybe I was confusing some stuff, but I really like that play with analogy of like a dam that doesn't work to begin with. And we're reading Seminar 3, and I like how maybe this ties in, I don't know, but like when he talks about the imaginary and the, what is it, Nick, the stickleback metaphor of captation, and how we there's another option in this sexual captation and the process of the imaginary, that, well, if we were like bumper cars purely in the imaginary, we'd just be bumping into each other, our sort of bodies, and that the phallic function or the name of the father is the thing that kind of brings the order to that failure. And maybe that ties into what you're saying about, well, we know it's messed up, but let's add pillars. And so it's going to mess up 5 minutes, but this kind of failed logic still works with the name of the father.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
This logic sort of, I just want to add sort of like misrecognized as intrinsic to the structure itself.
Absolutely. But then we can go on. I mean, it's interesting that now the analogy becomes so central. But two other points. I mean, one point is basically saying that at the end of the day, in spite of the need for temporary but then final extra supports to prevent the collapse of the dam, the plant starts working. Then the point there, what is the point about the plant? It has to produce as much fucking energy as possible, right? And let me just expand on the analogy. One could say the energy that is produced by the dam becomes what was animistically supposed to be the sprite of the river. Actually, it's a quantified sprite of the river, right? Capitalistically produced, and it generates income, blah, 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 blah. So that's another way to expand the analogy, right? So signifying differentiality, to go back to the second question, is always somehow repressed, allow me the expression, by qualitative difference. How many kilowatt we produced last year? Oh, we produced less than the year before, you're fired, something like that, allow me, right? So, but that is important to keep in mind. And the second point is to say that, and that ties in well, perhaps with the second question, but also with what Andrew was hinting at in terms of like, you know, playing with numbers, and I was on like cybernetics and the role of mathematics in this context, right? Fascination Lacan has throughout his life, etc. If you know, also specifically of formalization. And in analogical terms, I think like we should think something like, okay, you are like the first tree that fell contingently because of a storm or a beaver and blocked the stream, right? If we can think of a, you know, incredibly convoluted, sophisticated, and consistent construction coming out of blocking the river, but is not finalized to actually create as many kilowatt of energy as possible, that would be mathematics as just an incredibly sophisticated play with what is already there ontologically, with one trunk blocking the current of the river. I mean, the analogies, especially if impromptu, I mean, they have their limits, but I just wanted to open up that specific example, because a lot of what we've been discussing can, you know, can be brought in, and it can complexify even the triangulation in difference, and then difference for qualitative difference given together with sameness.
I wonder if it's too tall of an order to sort of link that to the second question, which has been on my mind. Something that your characterization of psychoanalysis as sort of a Galileanism evoked for me was also something that the philosopher Kojin Karatani says about Copernicus, who's obviously Galileo and his discovery, but how Copernicus, what the decentering that he effected through his discovery amounted to was sort of not just the idea that, oh, we are not at the center of the universe. Everything doesn't pivot about the fulcrum of humanity, but rather there's a difference between systems that we weren't even aware were systems to begin with, in a sense. And now it's like this difference generates the systems as pre-existing the difference retrospectively. I think this is kind of what we've been talking about in forms up until this point. But I don't know if that has anything to do with, like I said before, your characterization of psychoanalysis as a science which attempts to undermine the embedded telos that biology, and I think you say kind of embarrassing delay to biology in respect to other sciences in this regard, still operates. There's still this sort of albatross around science's neck, so to speak, that is an embedded understanding of life qua a possible realizable sexual relation between a one and a one that would form a one, two ones. But psychoanalysis, instead, what it does is reinscribes the non-formalizability into, well, our understanding of the subject of science.
Yeah, I mean, the claim I make and discuss quite extensively in the note too is indeed what you just said, in a sense. Like, I think for Lacan, biology, the life sciences, at least when he was writing, I think it still applies today by and large, is a non-Galilean science. It's basically still a kind of late continuation of animistic qua ancient Greek episteme, right? That's one topic. But then the question is not only what is wrong with that, but as you asked me, what is the relationship instead between psychoanalysis and modern science or Galileanism, right? The first general point is, like, unlike for Freud, and that's another difference, I think, Lacan's aspiration is not for psychoanalysis to become science. That's not an aspiration. There's a recognition that there would be no discourse of psychoanalysis without the discourse of science. There would be no discourse of modernity as such without the discourse of science. In a way, capitalism itself is a subset of the discourse of science, to simplify things. And in a way, there are big doubts for Lacan as to whether we can think a discourse that is not related as modernity to the discourse of science. Once we reach this, first threshold, then the question is, what is the relationship between Lacanian psychoanalysis and modern science as a Galileanism? And the question, I think, should be answered quite quickly. That's the way I thought it, at least, like earlier on, by saying that for Lacan, psychoanalysis is and it's not my phrase, it's actually Jean-Claude Milner, it's an extended Galileanism, So there's already a bit of a distancing from science. So let's take things step by step. So why can we say that? So psychoanalysis does not aspire to become a science, but there will be no psychoanalysis without the discourse of science, qua modern science. What does it say? What does it mean to say, like in that context, that what they share is a certain Galileanism? Then we have to specify extended, non-extended. It means that Lacan claims that the real, think of Galileo Newton, when I'm saying that. The real, and we'll have to distinguish what this real is, can basically be accessed only by means of mathematical formalization. So, yes, objection, isn't the real the impossible for Lacan? Yes, but it is also that which one can have access to only by means of mathematical formalization. Or to put the two things together, real as impossible, real as accessible by means of mathematical formalization. What is at stake is the impasse of mathematical formalization and the formalization of that impasse. And this is also the gap, in a way, between Galileanism, modern science in its incredible effectiveness, let's say technology, which entails going to Mars or Proxima Centauri, but also potentially annihilating ourselves in an atomic holocaust. That is the difference between the outcome of modern science, based on a mathematical formalization, and an extended Galileanism, psychoanalysis, which, in a sense, to go back to our previous exchange, basically says there's a problem if the way you do science is teleologically oriented only towards counting kilowatt, if not selling kilowatts. This is a big topic that you see my point. So one, let me just be very clear here. So one, psychoanalysis is closely related to science, even just historically. But two, psychoanalysis, unlike for Lacan, unlike for Freud, should not aspire to become a science. But C, what they have fundamentally in common, in this sense, they are Galileanisms, is the assumption, which, according to Lacan, is proved both in technology but also in clinical practice, that the real can be accessed only by means of certain formalization. But then there's a difference between the sheer effectiveness of mathematical formalization in science and what Lacan is trying to do in his extended Galileanism, by emphasizing that actually mathematical formalization is effective only because it builds and leads to an impassive formalization. And then the farthest step, and that would be what he calls the matheme, is what can we make, or why should we orient psychoanalysis towards what could be called a formalization of the impulse of formalization? It's a huge field we're dealing with. So, you know, like if you have, I could go on, and it's really close to what I'm working now, to be honest. I mean, maybe to simplify things, I would say, psychoanalysis is a Galileanism, because like modern science, after Galileo and Newton, it claims that, let's put it like that, our only active access to the real is given by means of mathematical formalization. But mainstream science, allow me the simplification, does not recognize the fact that mathematical formalization, its effectiveness is effective because it starts off from and leads to the impasse of mathematical formalization. And this is the double bind of science, in a way. And that's also why, and maybe this goes back a bit to what Andrew was saying earlier, or at least an exchange we had, the connection, the relation between psychoanalysis and mathematized science, Galileanism, and its incredible technology, is not the same as the relationship between psychoanalysis, according to Lacan, and mathematical formalization, non-scientific mathematical formalization, just, you know, mathematics for the sake of it. It's not the same thing.
If so, just to attempt to simplify things a little bit, I know you say that, you know, what's foreclosed in science, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but like what's foreclosed in science, maybe we could say the subject that is foreclosed in science, you know, it reappears, and what's foreclosed along with it is, I think you used the word kind of intensification of what it intervenes to. In that sense, does psychoanalysis occupy a contrasting position of, as you said before, accounting for this impasse as its point of departure?
Yeah, I mean, the other way to put it, like quite schematically, and thanks for what you just said, it does help a lot, is to say that science is a Galileanism. Psychoanalysis is a Galileanism. But the problem with science is that it is not an extended Galileanism. And in not being an extended Galileanism, what is left out? One, the subject, and second, in close connection, the acknowledgement that the effectiveness of mathematical formalization depends on the impasse of formalization. And that's how you see there's a close relation between these two levels, which are not two, of the real. Because here you get back to the usual Lacanian formula of the real as impossible. The impossible as the impasse of formalization. But formalization is that which actually gives me access to the real, to simplify nature, as witnessed by the incredible successfulness of applied Galileanism, i.e. technology. Because it's not just like that we are actually contemplating the possibility that there's a planet 9, right? Or even, you know, like a red dwarf. I mean, these are theories, it's the scientific theories, right? That in our solar system, there's probably like a red dwarf very far away we've never seen. You know, this is like really abstract physics, right? But then there's applied physics, and it fucking works. But the problem, this is the double bind of science for Lacan, that on the one hand, it does have access to the real, and there's no other access to the real. It's the same access that psychoanalysis should have, right? But as he says at one point, science doesn't have the foggiest idea of why it does have access to the real. I.e., the guys are there just counting kilowatts. I mean, in a much more interesting manner, right? You know, it could be Stephen Hawking and on black holes, which is much more interesting than counting kilowatts. But you see, like, if you're starting just counting and selling kilowatts and then counting profit, then you're forgetting precisely what gives you access to the real by means of the letter, mathematical formalization, right? this is an incredibly, I think like this is one of the most underrated, underestimated connections in Lacan's thought, because it's always, I mean, right now what I'm writing is about Lacanian set theory, triangulating with Badiou as well. But these questions are huge because, you know, the question of formalization and the question of science are connected, but they're not the same question. So, yes, the problem with science, to sum up what you're saying, is that it doesn't acknowledge the impasse, to simplify, and it forgets of the sign of the subject, which is one and the same. But it works. It works, right? It works. But this forgetting, precisely because it works, has potentially apocalyptic consequences. And to be honest with you, you know, like, and this is quite provocative. I was just discussing this with Frank Ruder recently. I would say even in Badiou, but in Lacan, you know, like there's a bad Heidegger, and there's a kind of like Heideggerian vein here against technology, which is still very much present in what we're saying. And my reaction would be to say, quite unfashionable today, why not? I mean, like, we all have a problem with technology, right? I mean, like, what's wrong with, in a certain way, developing some Heideggerian, you know, like polemics in a new fashion.
Yeah. One of the things that makes me think about with this, what you've elaborated on with science, and Nick mentioned the subject of science, is that, as you said, that modern science is, in a sense, Galilean, but not extended, whereas psychoanalysis. And would you say that, well, like the way modernity or modern science functions is within what Lacan will talk about with university discourse, and of course psychoanalysis cannot arise but through science, but only in a sort of real form as the hysteric discourse. But because it's like, if you turn it a certain way, then the hysteric discourse becomes the analyst discourse. But that there is a sort of knowledge that comes from the hysteric, which is part of the subject of science.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, I mean, like, the first part of your question, I absolutely agree. And yes, I mean, modern science is, rightly so, according to Lacan, Galilean, which means that, you know, you can access the real only by means of a mathematical formalization. But at the same time, it is not really Galilean. In a sense, there's, you know, in our accountant at the power plant, there's always like a going back to a pre-modern understanding of science, which is all about totalization and unification. That is to say, it's based on the presumed assumption that there is a correspondence between an intuitive correspondence between, let's call it sensibility, or my own perception as Homo sapiens, and the outside world, right? There's always a falling back into what is basically ancient episteme. I mean, one could exaggerate and say, you know, like, if the hydroelectric plant, not to mention a nuclear plant, is theologically finalized just to make money, then science has forgotten about the fact that actually, even if it seems to me that the sun rotates around the earth, it's the other way around. You see, I mean, this is a provocation, but this is the whole point. You know, like, in a sense, psychoanalysis is there to remember science, that that science itself is the only event that we know happened in human history, but they don't have the foggiest idea about it. This is the point. So, and yes, that's where, in a way, one could say that modern science, as not really Galilean, is the university discourse. Whereas there is instead kind of like, one maybe could say, you know, hysterical quanti-totalizing tendency, original tendency in modern science that has been repressed, if you want to put it like that. Then in terms of the theory of discourses, of course, like the whole complication is, you know, if one wants to be more political, what is the place of capitalism there, you know? It's an interesting, and I don't think like there are final answers. I mean, especially in terms of politics, there are just hints in Lacan, and there isn't like a political sense. But I think I mentioned earlier, in a way, you know, I mean, science, it says, quote unquote, Seminar 17, if I remember correctly, you know, strangely ended up copulating with capitalism, strangely contingent. But you see my point. I mean, the point here is that actually it could have been different. It just continuously happened historically, you know, like it's an interesting point in historically, politically, even in terms of history of science, you know, like the point there would not be to say that, let me put it like that, even though it's really broad and tentative. It would not be to say something like modern science was perverted in its course as an access to the real because of the fact that capitalism came up with technology. No. The point is to say that modern science and the modern subject is profoundly antinomic. In a sense, it could not have ended up with the prospect of both landing on Proxima Centauri and at the same time imploding Earth. Capitalism is a radical historical contingency that profited on. In that sense, it is an hegemonic subset of science somehow. It's a really original take on modernity, I think, because usually we tend to look at things, you know, as per, even if you, let's say, divide a good science from a bad science, you say, well, you know, the problem is technology, technology equals capitalism, right? Something like that. And this take is more complicated, more interesting, I think.
It makes me think about the thing that you mentioned about how in capitalism it's not a matter of even just measuring kilowatts for the function of a dam, but now like you get paid just to count, right? How many kilowatts did we produce this year? And it's like, well, if there was a telos to science, it kind of is like set back based upon counting. So there's like, if there was a goal or a telos for totalizability or totalization in science with knowledge, that it is stopped based upon counting. And at the same time, it's like it's counting is in the process is trying to count to get to that unified truth. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, this is where we get maybe the relationship between knowledge and jouissance. What does Lacan say in Seminar 17? That it's jouissance is like the cousin of knowledge, or like the sister of knowledge, or something like that. And I guess I'm trying to like spitball and tie in this counting in science with the Don Juanism of the counting of woman, right? And knowledge of woman is.
Yeah, no, I see the connections. I mean, we have to be careful there in terms of like, let me put it in this way. I mean, there's a good counting and there's a bad accounting in terms of accumulating. And this is like perhaps like an intuitive way of looking at the two sides of science, according to Lacan. You know, like in a way, going back to the metaphor of the river and the hydroelectric plant, you know, there's accounting, which is, you know, the tree that fell on the riverbed and stopped the current and potentially allowed you to build the power plant. And as I said before, we can also speculate about a power plant which is not philologically finalized at selling kilowatts, right? So there is, to be more technical, there is a level with the letter which has to do with a count that is a unique count, although repeated. Mm. And this is the level at which mathematical formalization operates effectively on the basis of an impasse leading to another impasse, right? And then you have a level of counting, which is accounting in a everyday sense, finalized accumulation. And if you want to be more philosophical, like an accounting philologically directed towards the impossibility of a totalization, right? And again, that's where science doesn't know what it is doing, because in a sense, if we can predict, the orbit of a planet before observing it, it's just because of the counting, not of the accounting. It's interesting, right? We don't, you see, like we can predict absolutely incredible things, even astronomically, but we still haven't decided how many planets we have in the solar system. It's still, like, look, this is Zizek, like with Hegel, et cetera, et cetera. So Pluto was a planet, right? Last 50 years. I mean, I'm an amateur. I like reading about astronomy. I don't know shit technically, but this is what happened in the last 50 years. So we discovered Pluto. Pluto was a planet. Then it was, declassified somehow, right? It's no longer a planet. But then there's serious research about a supposed planet 9, right? Because of like extra Neptunal objects that have like absurd elliptical trajectories, which would call for the presence of a gas giant, I don't know, like 20 AU away, something like. You see, like, this is interesting, right? So you can predict the existence of an object by means of a pure counting of the first level somehow, right? That is to say, a counting that is not, in a sense, accounting unities or units even. But on the other hand, when we actually adopt a much more accounting perspective in on scientific matters, we're lost. I'm sorry, this was just like an excursus, but it's, yeah.
No, I love that. I think we're both going to be listening and re-listening to this conversation years into the future to parse through everything we've touched on. But maybe this would be a good time to introduce the fourth question then, which I think is related to counting. It's not for nothing that the title
absolutely
of your book is The Not To. And you mentioned, I think, in the introduction to that book that you find many of the doxastic takes and reductions of this formula. There is no sexual relation, unsatisfying, ultimately. And I think if I understand even a fraction of The Not To well enough, that it's almost that this impassive formalization might arise through the impossibility of counting one as one, and that subsequent sort of counting process that arises from that, the integers that repeat indefinitely, has something to do with the sexual non-relation and everything we've been getting. Actually, I shouldn't say the sexual non-relation, because I remember you mentioned that, there's the phrase, there is no sexual relation. Then Lacan sort of flirts with this notion of there being a sexual non-relation, but ultimately goes back to this maxim. But can you touch on what I just said, but also explain why the meaning of this formula is not
Mm.
a nominalist maxim.
Yes, there's a lot there. Let me just I have it written down. So I thought this is like the most difficult question, to be honest, number 4. So the question reads, how is there is no sexual relation? It's a really good question. How is there is no sexual relationship a real proposition and not simply a nominalist maxim, right? I think I'll stick to my notes for the quick answer, because this took me more time to come up with. So why is it a real proposition and not, I mean, there is no sexual relationship. Why is it a real proposition, not simply a nominalist maxim? So it is a real proposition, I would say, on 2 related levels. The first, the more simple, it is a real proposition because it is based on some kind of empiricity. In terms of what? In terms of everyday love and sexual life as an impossibility, right? Like sex sucks. Mm-hmm. It doesn't, I mean, it works. It's non-optimal, right? I mean, that's why we were talking of the hydroelectric plant as always non-optimal, right? So it is a real proposition because actually it is a proposition that psychoanalytically comes out of the clinic, or even it is that which enabled the historical emergence of Freudianism. You know, it's the hysteric that makes Freud, not the other way around. Mm-hmm. So, but this is not enough, because here we are saying like it is real because it has to do with everyday reality, and that's not enough. Okay, but there's something important there, because if I say in a quite strictly mathematical logical sense, there is no sexual relationship is an axiom. Mm-hmm. So an axiom is that axiomatic decision about something whose terms you do not know anything about, right? And I think this is what Lacan does. It's a decision. Nonetheless, this is an axiomatic decision in a kind of formalizing sense, because then he comes up with the formulas of sexuation, etc. But it's based on a kind of axiom that is axiomatic in a kind of old-fashioned way, ancient Greek. No? An axiom in Euclid has to do with something intuitive, like a common knowledge that is almost like a natural knowledge. And I think there is this level. You see the point we're making? I mean, there is no sexual relationship is a real proposition because it has to do with the fact that in everyday life, empirically, sex doesn't work well. If it works, it doesn't work optimally. Optimally, I don't know why. This is the first level. But without solutional continuity, the second level, there is no sexual relationship, is a real proposition, because Lacan, with this proposition, claims that this proposition has, I would say, a foundational value. In what sense foundational? Phylogenetically, ontogenetically, structurally, and even ontologically. So it has to do with something which is intuitively axiomatic in our everyday life. So it is real qua empirical, and it is real because it does have, on different levels, and this is where things get difficult, a foundational value. I mean, there is, let's leave aside phylogenesis, but ontogenesis, which is, you know, like the good old story of the Oedipus complex, et cetera, castration, whatever. This is what starts the process of subjectivation qua sexuation, sexuation qua subjectivation, and the old Freudian story. I mean, it's little Hans that actually, you know, cannot think the sexual relationship because he thinks like, mommy has a Vivi Macher, right? So you see in what sense, like ontogenetically, structurally it's the same. I mean, structure pops in when in ontogenesis, this absence of the sexual relationship as real in the ontogenesis of the child is somehow sutured, right? Like with a logic of sexuation, and then more or less like we can cope with things, right? But I was also saying that it is a real proposition because it also has, in addition to having phylogenetic, ontogenetic, and structural, and the three go together, value, foundational value, it also has ontological foundational value. And in relation to that, I would say even ethical and political value, when what we are saying, we go back to the previous point, is being formalized. So if this is a difficult passage, so if we're saying that for Lacan there is no sexual relationship, has a foundational value ontogenetically, i.e., it is that which really makes me become a more or less screwed up subject in a structure, that also has an ontological value for Lacan, as soon as we are formalizing what we've just said on the ontogenetic structural level, right? You see the difference? I mean, because one thing is thinking about, there's a lot, so you have there is no sexual relationship, and the logic of sexuation, there is no sexual relationship is precisely, the moment when I push the button, right? The plant is ready and it doesn't fucking work, right? So then, okay, let's get some impromptu pillars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that would be the logic of sexuation, right? As a kind of, non-optimal cork, right? But one thing is thinking of that in ontogenetic structural terms, right? It just happens. What we're talking about, this logic of sexuation, is that which makes you Nick and me, Lorenzo, and whoever else, right? Another level, which is also foundational ontologically, I would argue, for Lacan, is to actually think about this in a formalized manner. Because that's where, in a way, why ontological? Because that's where, in a sense, ontogenesis and structure, the insertion of structure into ontogenesis and phylogenesis enables you to think being qua being at the end of the day. I mean, this is a bit of a jump. But let me put it like that. One thing is like talking about there is no sexual relationship, and well, there's a phallic function, more or less we patch things up, right? And we are speaking here. We are talking about these things now, right? Another level is to actually formalize that. It's really confused by commentators. Like Lacan is doing the two things, right? One thing is like a theory of ontogenesis, of how a subject becomes a subject, only qua screwed up sexuation that answers to a fundamental impossibility, or one, yes, of the sexual relationship. Another thing is, but why the hell does it need to formalize it? Is it just a game? No, the formalization is necessary in order to actually show that this ontogenetic, the ontogenetic structural foundational value, there is no sexual relationship, and what supplements it, complements it, or partially rectifies it in terms of the logic of sexuation, that is just something that happens, but we can think it as something that happens, and we can think it by means of formalization, or better, how an impasse, I don't understand sex, like Hans, gives rise to a transcendental logic that tries to cope with it. I can put that into writing by means of certain kind of formalization that shows an impasse of formalization. So that would be the matheme, right? The matheme is not Lacan scribbling, random things, and then you have Lacan and say, oh, well, this is wonderful mathematics. It's not. The matheme is philosophically very clear. A theme is the formulas, basically. It's the formalization of an impulse of formalization. And why is this not just a game? Because this is what makes you a fucking subject, or a non-fucking subject, actually.
So to like grossly oversimplify what you're saying, it's kind of like if Lacan isn't talking about what you're saying now, if he's not talking about the formalization of the impassive formalization via the mathemes, then the maxim, there is no sexual relation, would just amount to a very sophisticated version of men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and we're all fucked. Yes, we are all fucked, but we can't end the conversation there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's why I said, like, when you actually shift from the kind of ontogenetic structural level to the ontological level, there's also like an ethical and political level that comes with the ontological, or at least there's an opening. Why? Because in a sense, you know, the end of analysis as terminable analysis, and there's an unterminable analysis, has to do, in my modest understanding, with you coming up with your singularized version of the formulas of the situation. You don't really probably need to write it on paper. Maybe your analyst should. I'm really simplifying, you know, and that, I mean, I don't want to, you know, simplify excessively, and already simplify excessively, but the end of psychoanalysis is, in my understanding, your own writing of who you are on the basis of how you are sexuated, right? Mm. And that is an ethical and political opening, because the presupposition is that actually what you said, in a way, if we don't have this formalization, it may be propedeutic, it may be metapsychological, but it can also be very much related to practice. Then it's just like another stupid maxim, in a way.
Right. Maybe, you know, at the risk of being too, like, again, oversimplifying or poetic, it's like almost the topology of the self, or a matheme of the self that could metaphorize the end of analysis. I don't know. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah. Why not? I mean, yeah. I mean, clearly, I mean, the matheme of the self, where there is no self, because this is what a matheme is, right? I mean, selfness is precisely like, you know, like one of the epitome of the fantasy of unification, totalization, right? But yes, I'm a theme of the self that the range, you know, where the R is strongly ontological somehow. But that's where, just quickly, I mean, not including your questions, but that's the only level where I see a strong ethics and politics of psychoanalysis, because that is the end of analysis, quite terminable, but it's the opening up of what I would call a field, a discursive field, which goes beyond the cabinet. I mean, you get your own matheme. Now, what the fuck are you going to do with that? Well, you know, like, there are other people there who have their own matheme. We are really simplifying. But that is, for me, the only future of psychoanalysis. Not a discourse, to go back to Andrew and, you know, the 4 discourses. That's very specifically the discourse of the analyst, right? One of the 4 discourses. So it's clinical. It has to do with practice in terms of one-to-one sessions. Here, I think we are instead at the threshold of a discourse of analysis, and there are bits in the last Lacan where he speaks about that. You know, what would it mean? You know, the discourse of analysis is not the discourse of the analyst. It comes after the end of analysis, and in that sense, there is a unendlich analysis, you know. So analysis is both endlich, it can end, it should end, and endless, in terms of like the discourse of analysis, which is not just the discourse of the analyst. But something else I thought earlier, you know, because the question is really quite difficult, because I haven't said anything about the nominalist maximum, to be honest. One could say, I'm just, you know, bending the rules here, that there is no sexual relationship is, as a nominalist maxim, a real proposition. It becomes a bit, why is it also nominalist maxim? Because basically, it strongly has to do with the nature of language, right? I mean, there is no sexual relationship equals there is language. This is the point in Lacan at the end of the day, right? He says, like, we don't say what comes first. That would be totally asking the wrong question and giving the wrong answer. But there is no sexual relationship, and there is language is one of the same, right? You're looking at the same thing, basically. So, in a way, it is a nominalist maxim. It has to do with fucking language. But as a nominalist maxim, it is a real proposition at the same time. Maybe that would be like the best concise answer I can give for the time being to your question. It is, as a nominalist maxim, a real proposition, and our access to the real. Because here, the access to the real would be, for the subject, would be precisely the theme we were talking about earlier on.
That was great. I know we're approaching the 2-hour mark here, and I'm sure Andrew has plenty to say, but we don't want to detain you for too long. But I just wanted to ask, and this is more just, you know, as a fan of your work, very general question, like how you feel at this point in your career about subjectivity and otherness and the place it has in your bibliography.
Well, in a sense, I think everything else I wrote after that book follows from that book. So it's really, you know, I'm really attached to it very much. It gave me, let me put it like that, it enabled me to actually take more risks in what I'm now saying, because I can somehow say what I'm trying to say now, and right now I can substantiate it on a certain, hopefully almost consistent reading of Lacan, which is at the end of the day mine. I mean, of course, it's strongly backed up exegetically, but I don't have like a claim to exclusiveness. You know, like even on the question of the drive, there's Lacan on the drive that speaks very much in the terms of Slavi, you know, like, absolutely. So, but no, A, I remain very attached to that book. B, there are things I would rectify, yeah, here and there, but substantially I abide by it. And whenever I write something new, I actually always go back and, you know, try to confirm that it is consistent with that general outlook. At times, it is not, and hence it calls for either a rectification or, you know, like a zooming in. And I guess like one of, you know, in terms of, given that I was quite young, I mean, it was my PhD at the end of the day. A reduced version of my PhD, to be honest. Yes, I think like probably what I would not totally, but thoroughly revise is the stuff towards the end about the later Lacan, whom I now have read much more thoroughly, and I think there's much more to be said there. Not so much Joyce and politics and the name. I mean, right course, right direction, but things are slightly more complex there. In relation to what you've been reading, the two of you, I mean, like, what leaves me really satisfied, and I'm not sure I could do the same kind of job today, is on the imaginary. I think, like, you know, that's something really, even later when I got back there by means of biology, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the stuff on the imaginary, I think, of course there's more to say, but of course you can come up with a different consistent reading. But yeah, that's the early part of the book. The first third probably, or even less because it's shorter. I mean, that stuff, yeah, I subscribe to it fully. Yeah.
Yeah, we continue to revisit, especially that part, to get a strong grasp of the imaginary, because I think the work that Andrew and I are doing now, reading these early seminars, a lot of people skip to 7 or 11, but I think that it's very important to lay a strong foundation for understanding the registers. And that book has helped us enormously in understanding how the imaginary is kind of hooked onto the symbolic. And I think we're hoping that that will, in some ways, safeguard us from nominalizing the real, because I think it's really important to read those early seminars to avoid that, because it just seems to be a rampant phenomenon.
Absolutely. No, and I totally agree, because one of the biggest methodological problems with certain readings of Lacan, allow me the expression, is the assumption that the imaginary is the shit order. Like it's like the bad order. The simple. Like that's really wrong. And that's why I think like the seminar 1 and 2 are great, especially with regard, in my view, to showing how to simplify in the animal kingdom. And there are some Heideggerian simplifications in what Lacan says there about animals. But basically, the imaginary is the real, right? So the biological side of the imaginary is preponderant, logically speaking, when we're thinking about it, over what we all know about the imaginary. Like it's the ego, and the ego is not the subject, and the image is not the real. Ooh, yeah, sure, but first and foremost, images are gestalten. Images are, according to a now old but not so refuted theory, that's how like release mechanisms triggers work in animals, right? I mean, the gestalten theory is, to the best of my understanding, not the most contrasted or refuted theory. Clearly it's not in its heydays, but you see my point. I mean, that biological work is so important, Lacan does. It avoids you to fall back into that position of, first there was the imaginary and it was a shit order, and the symbolic is a bit better, but when you get to the real, that's real, like, and there's a lot of that, however sublimated in, sophisticated language, there's a lot of that wrong rhetoric, not even a methodology, to be honest.
Right, because then it loses the sort of structural implication that he's adding to that. And so like you just get the term, like you let God out, the front door to let him back into the back door, with this like teleological vitalist notion. Or like we get into just like Lacanian stage theory of like, oh yeah, you got the imaginary, then you got the symbolic, and then you reach the real, which we've encountered many times, like this sort of error of reading it that way. Or to even just say like, oh, Lacan in the early seminars is purely in the imaginary. But no, like the registers are already there. And I think this is why, like, for me, I'm so obsessed with the optical schema, because he shows that, well, you have to have the symbolic order language there for that to even be possible. That like he'll say like, in the optical schema, you're not just the eye. So like it's the subject that, when it's aligned with a certain point, could allow the image, the real image, to come out of that bouquet. But it's always already an inversion, because it's you wouldn't get a bouquet without being in that, calculated point, but it's a misrecognition, and it leaves something out. So that something out, that mysterious something, is in a sense, I think, maybe the real, but you already know, like he will say real as reality. But I got this from Zizek, like, and I want to know what you think. Like,
but even the flowers, right? I mean,
right?
Of course, that's not a good image of the real as impossible. But as I tried to say earlier, in the sense of the real as impossible, it's not mutually exclusive with the real as matter in nature.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, the flowers there, well, it's a fucking real. Why not?
Yeah.
you know? Yeah, no, the optical schema, I mean, to be honest, it's really complicated. And there's a PhD student of mine who's actually devoting a good chunk of his PhD to reading closely the various instantiation of the optical schema, because we realize there isn't much good work being done there, because most work resents from what we were criticizing earlier, right?
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think like you do get an instance of a real in seminar 2, and Zizek will say that, because he'll say like you have symbolic real, imaginary real, and real. He attributes real of the body in Irma's injection, like a Freud looking down Irma's throat and seeing this like impossibility of accounting for himself in the dream. He's like caught in this like horror. But there's like this logic of impossible real in Lacan's use of the purloined the odds and evens game, right? This sort of structural antagonism that, based upon an error or a compulsion to repeat, keep going through, but it's like a non-totalizability. And the joke that I like, I've said it many times, but like he'll talk about like the idiot boy who goes into a funeral, says many happy returns. He gets beat up and says, you're supposed to say, may God rest his soul. And he goes to the wedding and he says, may God rest his soul. And so it's like, you're always learning too late, but it's like this impossibility of getting it right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, some of those early, even examples are far more complex than people usually take them to be. Optical schema. I mean, the free prisoner sophism is really convoluted, and especially if you then take into account what he says later. I think it's seminar 8, perhaps, and not sure. I guess like maybe because I have not, for some reasons, more or less symptomatic, taken a very temporal perspective on these issues. Perhaps that's really in the literature. There are a couple of good works on Lacan in time, but there's a huge gap, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, apart from saying the usual, and even that usually very simplified in terms of retrospective temporality, etc. There's much more to be said. Much more.
Definitely. Yeah. There's one thing that you said in one of the lectures, I forget what the name of it is, but I think you talk about was it jouissance and transgression. And I really like how you said that, well, the jouissance that exists in the early Lacan is located in the Kojevian master-slave dialectic. And it's that the other has something that is enjoyable, and I want to have the other's enjoyment, but then at the same time, if I obtain it, then I lose, the master, the other whose enjoyment makes enjoyment possible. But would that still be sort of an imaginary relation, this impossible jouissance?
Well, it's a kind of like mirror relationship, right?
Okay, yeah.
It's like I want to be that image and what that image enjoys, but given that I'm here and the image is there, if it were possible for me to be there, I'm no longer here. You see my point? I guess, right. But I think this is quite precisely the way in which he brings in jouissance earlier on, in a way. And I don't think it's like forcing on his part to actually relate it to the Kojevian master and slave dialectic. Then, of course, like things get far more complex on jouissance. But yeah, I mean, it's a good first, grasp of intuitive almost of why. Yeah, and why the fantasy that the other, which is actually me in an imaginary relation, always enjoys more than what I enjoy. But even if I were to actually grab that, then I'm there. I'm no longer here. I mean, to simplify things.
Should we quilt it there? We're at 2 hours.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yes. Well, thank you guys. I mean, it was great chat.
Yeah, this was really exciting. Would you like to plug your forthcoming volume with Adrian Johnston before you leave? What's it called?
Oh, the one with Adrian, God is Undead.
God is Undead. Yeah, we're
Yes.
really looking forward to that one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully the publishers, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
get up off the presses and make something
Yeah,
happen.
well,
So,
I'm still hoping for like early 2024. But yeah, maybe I'm still too optimistic, but yeah, it will come out sooner or later.
fingers
Nice.
crossed. All right, then hopefully we can do this again at some point in the
Yeah,
future. This was a just
pleasure.
amazing conversation.
Definitely.
True honor for us.
Well, thank you for the questions, because I rarely get like good and short questions, and this really helps starting a conversation. Of course, we didn't stick to the questions very precisely or to the answer to the questions, but it's yeah, I think you have like a nice format, because it prevents the risk of like going everywhere and nowhere.
Right.
So
Well,
in
the thing
spite
is,
of having
yeah, it's just gonna say we're just two guys learning Lacan right now. Like we're not in the academy.
Yeah.
We're just kind of
well, it looks
yeah,
like you read him very carefully.
Yeah.
So
Or we should say we're the not two.
yeah.
introduce
Nice.
ourselves as the not two vanishing mediators.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's a
thanks for
nice
giving us our moniker.
initiative as well, like to have this, conversations online, and yeah, thank you.
Yeah, hopefully one of many into the future. So thanks
Sure.
again.
Yeah. Thank you.
And yeah, good luck with everything.
Thanks. Good luck to you as well. Bye bye.
Bye, Lorenzo.